Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Thank you for joining me. Before we get into the topic of the day, I want to make a personal note. Felix Rodriguez. I'm sure most of you know who Felix is. Well, Felix has been ill the last few weeks. I'd just like to send out our best wishes to Felix. Hope he gets well soon. With that, let's get into the topic of the day. Last week, I went back to the Camarena case, and we talked about the reasons why the Camarena case is personal to me and why it's still important. The things we can learn from it, the things that we don't know, all of those issues were discussed last week. One of the things that I mentioned last week is that my current obsession, and the obsession on the Camarena case changes from time to time, but my current obsession is the kidnapping itself. So this week and next week, we're going to talk about the actual abduction of Agent Camarena from outside or across the street from the American consulate. We've talked about this before, but as I promised you last week, we're not going to do a complete repeat. We've got some new information, and I want to talk about this in a slightly different way. So this week, we want to focus on the timeline. I mentioned this some last week, but I really want to get into the timeline proposed by the witnesses, and see how those timelines can be different, and see if any of them fit with the known events. So if you have the events that we know occurred and we know what time it is, if somebody's going to say something happened with respect to the Camarena abduction, it has to fit within that known time window. You may ask yourself, why are we going through this again? Or why are you going through this again, Jack? And the answer for me is a couple-fold. One is just that it's perplexing to me, and so I continue to obsess about it. The second is, I think if we know how it happened, not just in the time frame we're talking about this week, but also in the actors and kind of some other surrounding circumstances that we'll talk about next week, perhaps it gives us better insight on who was involved, who ordered the kidnapping, and that also then leads into why. So that's why I think it's important. It's why I think it's significant. And remember, we may have another Camarena case sometime in the future if Rafael Caro Quintero is extradited. So trying to answer some of these questions, I think, is helpful and interesting. I mentioned this a long time ago, but one of the things that's very interesting is that in the two Zuno trials, Zuno 1, Zuno 2, 1990, 1992, the discussion of the actual kidnapping is very minimal. As we'll talk about in a little bit, Rene Lopez Romero testifies about it, but it's very short. It's not in detail. And in one way, that makes sense, right? The charges were conspiracy to commit the murder, conspiracy to kidnap. So in many respects, the fact that Agent Camarena was kidnapped, I don't want to say it was irrelevant, but it wasn't necessary to the charges being presented. It was a given that he was kidnapped and then he was killed after being tortured. The real question for the jury and for the prosecution was, who was responsible for that? Who was involved in that? As I say, if you look at it in that light, the kidnapping doesn't really add much to the prosecution. On the other hand, especially in Zuno 1. The government took a lot of time, an awful lot of time, to describe somewhat meaningless, somewhat irrelevant facts to show how bad the so-called Guadalajara cartel was. There was all kinds of testimony about how grandiose they were, the gold-plated AK-47 that Caro Quintero had, and all these things. And one of the things, not to get too far astray from the topic, but one of the things that we really felt as defense attorneys was by the end of that presentation, the jury was so convinced that the cartel was evil, had done terrible things, had made lots of illicit money. They were ready to convict. And, that put everybody in the defense position in a very difficult spot. And then, of course, we went through the same thing in Zuno 2, even though in that trial, the evidence was a little bit more circumscribed. It was a little bit narrower. So you could see, while the kidnapping itself, the abduction itself, might not have been necessary for part of the prosecution's case, you could see where it would fit right in, right? Oh, here's all the bad things the cartel has done. Here's, all the ostentatious things they did with their money. And then look what they did to Camarena. Now, they got some of that in the interrogation and the torture of Camarena and the torture tapes, etc. But they never really spent time on the kidnapping itself. One of the other things I want to mention before we get into great detail here is there are certain people, I'll talk about specific ones, that have provided a lot of misinformation about the actual kidnapping itself. And one of those, of course, is Agent Bareilles, who I think exaggerates dramatically when he talks about the abduction. He says in his book that there were 6 or 7 cars involved in this kind of kidnapping posse or group of cars. He also says they had thousands of rounds of ammunition and grenade launchers. It would have been a bloodbath if anybody else had been there. We'll talk about those two things in particular next week. But then he also says there were dozens of witnesses, and that's just flat wrong. In fact, at best, there was one percipient witness, a chauffeur from the consulate, who was walking away from the kidnapping, turned back, saw a little bit of it, but didn't really know what he saw. There were not dozens of witnesses. There weren't lots of people on the street. That's completely wrong. So what do we want to talk about? Let's start. I'm going to go over this again. I know I mentioned it last week. We won't go too long. But let's talk about the day of the kidnapping. One thing that's fascinating is earlier in the day, Agent Camarena had left the DEA office, left the consulate, walked by himself to a bank, and walked back. So the kidnappers weren't there then or didn't see him then. Then what do we know around the time of the kidnapping? And this is very, very important. 1 p.m. Allen and Agents Batchelor and Kirkendall go to the Camelot restaurant, catty corner across the street from the consulate. They go there to meet with a confidential informant and some of the informant's family. About 1:20, Agent Camarena, after having been called by Agent Kirkendall to bring some money over, Agent Camarena walks across the street to the Camelot. 1:30, 1:35, someplace like that, Agents Camarena and Kirkendall walk back to the consulate. 1:45, more or less, Agent Bachelier returns to the consulate. And sometime after about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Agent Camarena leaves the consulate and is kidnapped. Now, we have to assume a couple of things about this. So at 1:20, Agent Camarena goes to the Camelot, right? We have to assume that the kidnappers weren't stationed outside of the consulate at that point. Why do we assume that? Because there wasn't anything that happened, right? So if we say 1:20, Kiki goes across the street, no kidnappers. 1:35, Kirkendall and Camarena go back to the consulate. Could the kidnappers have been hanging out someplace when that happened? Perhaps, but here's two important things to note. Number one, the DEA office, the agents in that office were on alert. They were worried about things going on with the traffickers. They were experienced, both Kirkendall and Camarena, experienced agents in Guadalajara. They didn't notice anything out of the usual. Number two, none of the alleged witnesses, we'll talk about them in a second, but nobody says, and it's never even hinted at, yep, we saw Camarena go by, but he was with another agent, so we didn't do anything, and then he came back, and that's when the abduction. That is never even hinted at. So, if that's the case, we can make a pretty good argument that at least from 1:35 to 1:40 or so, until about 2:05, let's say, more or less, when Agent Camarena left the consulate, that's the only window that can exist. We also note that at 1:45, Agent Bachelier went back across the street, didn't detect anything at all. So let's say that it's 1:40 or so to 1:45. So you got about a 25-minute window. Somehow, miraculously, these kidnappers arrive during that window and are lucky enough that Agent Camarena is coming out by himself, no other agents, nobody else around, and they're able to pick him off of the street with very little disruption. Okay. One could say, unless there's additional information, we'll talk about that, that these were the most fortunate kidnappers ever. Period. End of sentence. Okay. A couple of other things we need to keep in mind. To walk from the consulate to the Camelot and Kiki's truck takes 5 minutes max. Regardless of whether you wait for the traffic lights, if you jaywalk, 5 minutes max. All right. So if Agent Camarena leaves shortly after 2, realizing he's late for his lunch appointment with his wife, it's 2:05 or so, 2:10 maybe, before he gets out to his truck. Number 2, the drive from the consulate to Lope de Vega. And we're going to go with the assumption at the moment that Agent Camarena, when he was picked up, was taken to 881 Lope de Vega. The drive from the consulate to Lope de Vega is 15 minutes max. Okay. Agent Berea says it's 15 minutes in his book. There's testimony that it was about 15 minutes away. I've driven it, or been driven with a guide. That path and trying to think of what would have been the most logical route, we've done it 4 or 5, maybe 6 times, and we've always been closer to 12 minutes than 15. But let's just say 15 minutes. Okay. The other thing that's very important, this is more important for next week, and we'll mention it again, is remember that next morning, when Agent Kirkendall goes to the embassy, goes to Camelot, sees Camarena's truck there, the truck is unlocked. It is a point that I have had repeatedly said to me. Agents in Guadalajara always locked their truck. Kiki in particular always locked his truck. It was a relatively new truck. He loved it. He had the lights up top. He would not have left his truck unlocked, so he didn't walk someplace else, and his radio was in the truck, which again shows that sometime prior to being abducted or as part of the process, he had gotten to his truck. Okay, so think about that timeline and really think about that window. 140 to 2, I said 205 earlier. Let's say 140 to 210, a half hour. We have about 5 or 6 alleged sources, alleged witnesses who talk about this timeline for the abduction. One of them is Rene Lopez Romero. Remember, too, we've talked about the fact that for a long time, I think a lot of people thought that Rene Lopez Romero might have been, like he said he was, part of the abduction crew. I'm now of the belief that that's not true. There are several reasons for that we've talked about before. But let's just say the government put Rene Lopez Romero on as a percipient witness. He was in The Last Narc as a percipient witness. So in April of 1992, April 9, 1992 to be precise, Rene Lopez Romero is interviewed by the DEA. And there's a DEA 6 written to support or in after that interrogation. In that DEA 6, Lopez Romero says that a consulate employee, and was going to be the employee who could identify Camarena, he arrives at Lope de Vega at 12:30 in the afternoon. Rene says they have an immediate meeting and then left to go to the consulate. Okay. They say they waited about 20 minutes until Camarena left the consulate, and that's when they had the abduction. Let's think about that. 12:30. Let's say they had a half-hour meeting, which to me, based on everything, sounds like a very long meeting. But let's say it was a half hour and they left at 1. Right? They would have then got back to the consulate about 1:15. If they'd waited 20 minutes until Camarena left, well, if they'd waited 20 minutes, where does that put them? That puts them at 1:35, 1:40, right about the same time that Kirkendall and Camarena are going back to the consulate. So that doesn't fit, right? If they're back at 1:15 and waited 20 minutes, Kiki hasn't left yet. They'd have to have been waiting 45 minutes for Camarena to leave. So that timeline just doesn't make sense. Okay. What else do we have? We have Sergio Espino Verdin. You remember Espino Verdin was with DFS. He was arrested. He went through an interrogation in Mexico City, or a couple of interrogations in Mexico City, where some of which is where the DEA was present. Remember, we talked about in one of the interrogations, the DEA actually left because the interrogation by the Mexican officials was over the top, shall we say. In a DEA 6 dated June 9, 1986, he says that the order was given to leave Lope de Vega at approximately 12 noon, and that they returned to Lope de Vega about an hour later. Well, that can't be. We know that can't be, because we know when Agent Camarena walked across the street to the Camelot with the money, right? This would suggest that they had left Lope de Vega at noon, came back around 1, and that simply can't be. There are witnesses who saw him leave the consulate at 2 o'clock, or right about 2 o'clock, right? When he says, shit, I'm late for my lunch with my wife. Okay. Who else has talked about this? There is a DEA 6 of an unnamed source, and I could speculate, but I'm not going to, at least not right now. There's a DEA 6 of a confidential informant dated September 26, 1992. He says that he arrived at Lope de Vega with Fonseca at about 10 a.m. in the morning, and they left Lope de Vega around 12:30. Okay. Think about that, if you will. So that would have put them at the consulate at about 12:45, meaning that they would have had to have been there for what? If 12:45, an hour and 15 minutes takes them to 2, so maybe another 10 minutes. So they would have had to have been waiting for an hour and 35 minutes, during which time, again, they would have seen Alan Bachelor and James Kirkendall go across. They would have seen Kiki go across by himself. They would have seen Kirkendall and Camarena come back. They would have seen Bachelor go back. Nobody talks about that. The idea that they were sitting out there for an hour and 45 minutes, nobody else talks about waiting that long, doesn't make any sense, does it? Interestingly enough, Rene Lopez Romero testifies in the afternoon of December 9, 1992. And you know what he said in that testimony about the timeline? Nothing. Not one simple thing. So we don't know. We know what he had said before. We'll talk about the other stuff he says surrounding the abduction next week. But as far as this timeline, doesn't mention it at all. In his book, Agent Barreas talks about the timeline of the abduction. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind, I want you to keep this in mind next week. After Zuno 2, after all the appeals, but before Agent Barreas' book, Jaime Kirkendall has his book come out. And one of the things that comes out in Agent Kirkendall's book is that idea that Camarena's truck was unlocked. Nobody mentions it. Nobody mentions anything about it until after that had happened. Okay. So what does Agent Barreas say in his book? He says, at 1:30 p.m., someone from the consulate arrived saying the, quote, lawman, unquote, was getting ready to leave for lunch. It takes 15 minutes to drive to the consulate. Less than 5 minutes after they arrived, Camarena was spotted leaving the building and walking towards his truck. Let's put that together. 1:30, 15 minutes to get there. That puts him at 1:45. Let's even give them 5 more minutes for a discussion before they leave. That puts them there at 1:50. They say less than 5 minutes after Camarena, or after that, Camarena arrived. But we know that's not true because we know where Agent Camarena was at 2 o'clock. And let me ask you this, folks. We're going to talk about what they say in The Last Narc in a second. But how is it that Agent Boreas could write a book that leads to or is associated with The Last Narc and the documentary, and it's based on the testimony of Jorge Godoy and Lopez Romero and Ramon Lira? But how could it be that you write a book and what you say in the book is different than what your witness said? Right? It doesn't make any sense. What do they say in The Last Narc? They say, well, first of all, let's keep in mind that they talk about this in episode 3. Remember, I always want to tell you specifically where things can be found. Episode 3, from about 3 minutes 45 seconds to about 8 minutes 30 seconds, they talk about the abduction itself, but they never really give a great timeline. What they do say in there is that Camarena called his wife, quote, about noon to ask her for lunch. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, remember that in The Last Narc, for the first time, if you go back to the first time, Lopez Romero talks about it in his DA6 in April of 92. He said that a consulate employee had come to Lope de Vega and he was going to point out Agent Camarena. Well, in this one, he says it was Rene Verdugo, which is absurd, and it didn't happen that way. But be that as it may, Verdugo, according to Lopez Romero in The Last Narc, arrived and said to Fonseca, sir, that person will come out at noon and we have to be there before then. He will come out at noon. We know 100% for sure that he didn't leave the consulate at noon. We know from Mrs. Camarena's own statements that lunch was supposed to be at 2. We know from people in the consulate, in the DEA office in the American consulate, who said that shortly after 2, Kiki said, I'm late to meet my wife for lunch, and left. There is no way that it would be accurate that Camarena called his wife and said, called her about noon to ask her to lunch. Number one, okay, we know that was earlier in the day when they discussed it. And number two, we know for sure that he didn't come out at noon. And yet, so much is being built on these witnesses. This whole stack of cards is built on the idea, house of cards, stack of cards, whatever. This whole house of cards is being built on the idea that Rene Lopez Romero and Jorge Godoy are credible witnesses. They're percipient witnesses. And yet, in The Last Narc, they're saying things that we know are demonstrably false. Okay. I also want to talk about one last thing. Annabelle Hernandez, who you know, or most of you should know, she's a Mexican journalist. She had interviews with Rafael Caro Quintero. She's had interviews with other traffickers. She oftentimes has very good, very credible information, apparently has pretty good sources. She wrote a book called Narcoland. And on page 44 of that book, if you give me half a second here, I'm going to tell you when that was published. So you know what? I'll tell you later. But anyway, she writes this book, Narcoland. Page 44, she talks about the abduction. And she says a couple of things that are very interesting. But specifically with respect to this timeline, she says that the abduction team that did not include Rene Lopez Romero, according to her version, her witnesses, and I should say that she's not making it up herself. She's what witnesses had told her. Doesn't include Rene Lopez Romero. They wanted to get to the consulate around 2 p.m. because the consulate would close at 2 p.m. and subsequent things I've heard suggest that it closed for a period of time at about 2 p.m. for kind of a siesta time. Number one, the people I have talked to have not substantiated that happened, that at 2 o'clock the consulate would close for whatever period of time. But even if that was the case, would that mean that the DEA office inside the consulate would close at 2 p.m. every day? That all of a sudden, 2 o'clock, we're working on cases. We got to go for an hour or whatever. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make any sense if you think about the idea you want to get Camarena alone, presumably, right? If you're the kidnappers. Remember again, Berea says, hey, if things had gone down bad, these guys were ready to go to war. They were well armed, etc. Well, if the consulate was going to close and the agents were going to leave at 2 o'clock, wouldn't you expect there to be more agents with Agent Camarena than just by himself? Wouldn't all of the agents be leaving if Camarena's leaving? Was he the only one who was allowed to leave during this siesta time? That just doesn't make any sense. But her book and those statements are the only ones that place it at about 2 o'clock. When we come back next week, and I had to split it up like this because we were either going to have a shorter one today and a little bit longer one tomorrow, or a very long one today, and I didn't want to do the very long one. So in the interest of efficiency and the sanity of my audience and not subjecting them to an hour and a half long discussion, we're going to do this in 2 parts. But next week, I want everybody to have this idea in their mind, this timeline, this fact that nothing quite adds up. Nothing fits with the known facts. We know when Agent Camarena went across to the Camelot. We know when he came back. We know when he left. Those are facts we can absolutely stand on. What we're going to do is look again at how the abduction allegedly occurred. This week we looked at what time it allegedly occurred. Now we're going to look at how it, the actual process itself, what was said by whom, who was there. And you're going to find the same thing. There was a dramatic inconsistency in all of these alleged percipient witnesses. What does that say to you? To me, it says a couple of things. It says, number one, that some of these percipient witnesses, I'm looking at you, Rene Lopez Romero, may not have been percipient witnesses. Number two, people may have gotten information secondhand, same idea, but got it wrong. Or number 3, which is not inconsistent with 1 and 2, but you have people lying but don't know the basic facts well enough to be schooled on how best to lie. Liars are going to lie, but the lie is going to be exposed if they don't know some of the basic facts. For example, the exact time that he was kidnapped, he being Agent Camarena. And going back to Jaime Kirkendall's book, at the time that Lopez Romero is making his statements, at the time that other DEA 6s are being prepared based on interviews with other witnesses, nobody knew about this back and forth to the Camelot. So liars with bad information are going to lie in a bad way. They're going to lie poorly. And all of this should have been exposed earlier. And it goes heavily to the weight you place on the credibility of Rene Lopez Romero. I still think anybody who watched The Last Narc thinks that Jorge Godoy is a nut job and hard to believe him about almost anything. Ramon Lira, who was in the documentary or the alleged documentary, doesn't have details about this. So much of it was based on Lopez Romero's testimony or statements, and his credibility has to be shattered. Has to be. On more than one occasion, he said things about the kidnapping that just absolutely cannot be true. So how can you believe anything else he has to say? All right, next week we talk about details about the abduction. That will put a bow on at least this portion of the discussion about the abduction. I am going to talk about some of the other interesting things from Annabelle Hernandez's book at that time as well. We'll kind of walk through the same pattern we did this week and expose the inconsistencies, the inherent flaws in the descriptions by these alleged witnesses. And we'll do that not only to get a better idea of who might have been involved, but also to identify the alleged witnesses who don't have credibility anymore. All right. That is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena for this week. Thank you for joining me. Have a great week. Try to stay cool in the summer heat, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you, everyone.